Hi, this is Mike here. Today we're going to be talking about how to service the CVT system on the Can-Am Outlander 450s from years 2016 to 2018 and I imagine beyond that. Um, Anyways, these belts are the Achilles heel of these bikes, as you guys probably are aware, and they need a lot of attention. This CVT is very finicky. And what I'm finding is that a lot of people do not know how to properly service them, and they're seeing their belts go out after a few hundred miles. And what we want to do is get you guys up to about 2,000 or maybe more miles out of a single belt. And that requires properly cleaning, properly lubricating, properly checking the CVT system at every service. So there's going to be some special tools you'll need for this job. The one on the left, the torque wrench. Get something that at least gets you 15 foot-pounds and goes up to 100. That's going to be needed for tightening the primary and secondary clutch bolts. The one next to it is the belt tool, which is what you'll need to remove the belt from the system. That one, it pretty much goes into the secondary outer sheave and expands the secondary clutch to enable you to remove the belt. The one next to it is to remove the flywheel / inner sheave for the primary clutch, and otherwise you're going to have a hell of a time taking the inner sheave off. The next two over are for tightening. The one with the little loop at the top is used for the secondary clutch. When you're tightening the bolt, you need something to hold that sheave or that clutch in place while you're tightening. And that's what that one's for. The next one over is for the primary clutch to hold that in place while you're tightening the bolt. Here's your teardown. This is after I've removed the instrument cluster, the little plastic thing that goes over the air filter box, the left body panel, and the left footwell. All that has to be removed. And remove the cover. Those bolts are pretty easy to take off. Just have a long extension. The inlet and outlet for the CVT cooler, those clamps have to be loosened, and the cover should just come right off. This is what's underneath. So you have on the left your primary clutch, and right above the primary clutch is your starter drive cap with the starter drive gear underneath that. On the right you have your secondary clutch. And you notice on the left side of the CVT you have the CVT cooling inlet, and on the right is your CVT cooling outlet. Before we tear anything down, I want you to take a look at this cover I took off after the belt blew up completely in it. There was no belt left. It was just a bunch of fuzz, like a rat was living in it, but obviously it was just the belt self-destructing. As you can see, there's a big crack there at that CVT. I believe that's the inlet. Big crack there. Actually, no, that's the outlet. Sorry. That was caused by the belt slapping the plastic, obviously, and cracking it. You can repair that with. I repaired it with a resin, like an epoxy, and that'll take care of that. Or you can spend the bucks and get a new one. But usually it's easy enough to repair on your own. Clean that case up. Take the gasket out, clean it up, because there's a lot of dust lining on the case, the interior. So clean that up with water and let it dry. If there's any broken pieces of plastic, like as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the plastic had cracked. So just remove any loose plastic, so that way it doesn't touch the belt when you put a new one on. It's not too essential to have all that plastic there. It's more for cooling and stuff, but as long as most of it's there, you're okay. Here's another view of the CVT cover, and you can see the broken plastic there. That's after I've washed it. Alright, so we're going to start taking stuff apart now. So choose the secondary or the primary clutch to take off first. It don't matter. For me, I'm going to take off the primary first. So what you'll want to do is take a 19mm socket, throw it on an impact or a breaker bar. I prefer an impact. It's easier. Now, keep in mind, that this primary clutch, which is on the left-hand side, is reverse thread. It's left-handed thread, meaning you will turn it clockwise to loosen it. Don't try and turn it the other way, because you're just going to end up breaking the bolt and everything's going to fly apart. So loosen that one up, but keep in mind that these clutches are spring-loaded, so keep a hand on the primary clutch forcing it inward so it doesn't pop out at you. Once you have the bolt off, then you can slowly release the pressure from it and it'll come apart. That spring isn't too difficult to deal with. The secondary one is a little more loaded. So when you do the secondary clutch on the right side, that's a regular thread. It's right-handed thread bolt. So you would loosen it by turning it counterclockwise. Now, put a lot of pressure on this one because the spring is really long for the secondary, and it'll pop out pretty far if you don't put your hand on it. So once you get the secondary clutch out and all the parts behind it, and you get the outer half of the primary clutch out, you're going to see the one-way bearing, which is what you see my finger pointing at. My finger is also pointing at two pins and springs, which are underneath the primary one-way bearing. So when you pull the primary clutch carrier out, do it slowly and have your fingers inside behind it so those pins behind it do not pop out. If they pop out, you'll probably never find them again and you'll have to buy new ones. But you may have to buy new ones anyways because they may be worn out. But if you do maintenance regularly, they should not be worn out for the first few times you open it up. But over the thousands of miles, maybe like 4,000 miles, the spring may be wore out to the point where you'll want to replace them. And the pins may also be worn out too, but less likely. If you've taken out the one-way clutch and got the pins and springs out, this is what you'll have in your hand. If you don't have them in your hand, that means you lost them, and you'll have to get a flashlight and find them or buy new ones. This is what it looks like. It's two pins and two springs. They come apart. Just set those aside. Don't lose them. Now get that special tool I was talking about that removes the flywheel / inner sheave for the primary clutch. Pretty much thread it in, and pretty much the end of that tool pushes against the engine, and the threaded part is what pulls the sheave out. And just hitting it with an impact, or I guess if you somehow lock that into place, you can get it with a breaker bar. But it'll pop right off. It doesn't take too much effort unless you've let it sit on there for thousands and thousands of miles without ever removing it. And also, before you put the tool in, you'll want to very lightly lubricate it with a grease on the threads and also at the very tip, so that way you don't wear out the tool. Alright, congratulations, you got everything off. Well, almost. There's a few more things. You're going to notice that there's still a plate on the right that kind of looks like a casket with two, I believe, 8mm bolts that are holding it together. You'll want to take that off. There's the range selector indicator wires underneath there, and a lot of belt dust collects in there. So if your belt blew up, then remove that. Even if it didn't, belt dust gets in there, so it's good to clean. Also on the left, you're going to see at the top the starter drive gear with that black cap over it. So take those two bolts out. Now keep in mind there's a little spring in the center of that cap, so it'll want to come out on its own. So make sure it doesn't fall, because you can lose that spring in the washer that's behind it. So get that cap off, take the starter drive out, and that should be it. So here's everything removed. That's all you have to do for the engine side. Okay, you're gonna have to do some cleaning, vacuum out the case, and vacuum out, more importantly than the case, vacuum out the CVT cooler inlet and outlet pipes. Because if your belt grenaded inside, you're gonna find all those ribs from the belt. They're gonna be in those tubes. So vacuum them out real thoroughly. You could even take off the tubes if you want to, but that's not necessary if you have a shop vac. Just get a vacuum cleaner in there and suck all that stuff out. Make sure every last bit is out, because you don't want one piece falling into the system after the fact and causing more problems. So this is what I'm talking about. Notice inside there it looks like a rat has made a nest. That's not the case. It's just that the belt blew and all that dust is inside there. So, like I said, vacuum out really good. Okay, so this is where the starter drive gear was. And notice where I'm pointing, there's a needle bearing in there. And if you don't have a blind bearing puller, I suggest that you clean that every time and re-lubricate it. Clean it with brake cleaner, get in there with a screwdriver and a paper towel or something to clean it up, let it dry, and then apply preferably Isoflex grease, which is what they call for, but of course you can use general purpose grease if you don't have that. Alright, so here's all the parts that we took off. A lot of parts, but really it's not that many. It could be worse. Anyways, everything on that table needs to be cleaned. Everything. So get at least 2 cans of brake cleaner, or contact cleaner or something, and clean that stuff up. You can use water if you want initially, but it doesn't really do a good job of cleaning, so brake cleaner is probably the best cleaner you can use. Of course they sell a proprietary cleaner for Can-Am, but it's pretty much brake cleaner, I'd imagine, so don't worry about using something that's not Can-Am branded. But yeah, clean every part there, every single part. Alright, look in the lower left hand portion of the screen, you're going to see the starter drive gear. Clean it really good with brake cleaner, but do not lubricate any part of it other than both ends of it, where one end goes in where the needle bearing is on the engine side, the other side goes in the cap, which is on the bottom of the screen you see there. So right here we have the secondary clutch outer sheath, and notice I'm pointing at a bearing. Now that bearing tends to survive fairly well in the CVT, but every service, for good practice, I like to remove that bearing, which you'll need a punch and a hammer. Remove the bearing, try not to damage it, remove the dust covers, clean it with brake cleaner, let it dry, and re-lubricate it with Isoflex grease. Here we have the one-way clutch. There's pretty much two identical bearings, one on either side of that clutch, and that is a major failure point on these. So this is pretty important. For that one, clean the outside of the carrier there and set it aside. We'll deal with it later. Another common failure point on these, that is the governor cup right there, the outer portion of the governor cup. And what you're going to see there is either 4 or 6 rollers. For the 450 there's 4 rollers and 2 don't have anything, and the 570, whatever the bigger one is, it'll have 6 rollers, and they will get flat spots sometimes. Sometimes the flat spots will be on the left or right side of it. Other times the shoes, which are on either side of the roller, get worn out, or you might have the combination thereof. Sometimes the rollers won't even roll anymore because too much belt dust has gotten in there. Either way, you have to, if any of those conditions are present, you have to take the rollers out, take the shoes off, and replace them. These are centrifugal weights, and that is the inner portion of the governor cup. That's the outer sheath for the primary clutch. There's 4 of those on the 450, and for the 570 there's 6. And there's different weights that you can put on depending on the altitude. The ones that are on this one are the standard weights that come with the bike. Those weights, they do fairly well, but over time, I've noticed over 10,000 miles, the weights tend to wobble out. The bushings inside of the weights wobble out, so they wiggle too much, and that causes problems with the rollers. You'll notice that the rollers get flat spots on either the left or right side, and you'll notice that the weights actually gouge the governor cup where they slide out during acceleration, and that's obvious to me that they need to be replaced at that point. But you can do a simple check with your finger. There's specifications in the Can-Am manual that you can follow as well. You're going to find this on the secondary clutch. Remove it. There's just a band holding it in, and you can put it back in pretty easy. Take it out and clean it. Inspect it. Now, you're not going to clean it completely. Some of that black stuff is not going to come off. But you can get most of it off. Just the surface stain, it doesn't matter, and it'll never come out. So don't even try it. Check it out, inspect it, make sure that it's not cracked or anything like that, or worn out abnormally. If so, replace it. This is the cam that you probably took off, hopefully took off, behind the secondary clutch. Inspect it after you clean it, and again, make sure it's not cracked, make sure it's not overly worn. If so, simply replace it. Here you have the secondary spring. On the right is the spring that I took out. The one on the left is a brand new spring. Notice there's a difference in height. There is a specification for that in the manual. I go by just looking at it and determining it for myself whether it's good or not. And this one was barely compressed from the new one, so I'm just going to put that one back in. It's not out of spec, but make sure you clean it, of course. Unlike the secondary spring, the primary spring doesn't really wear out as fast. Notice that they're the same height, so obviously I'm not going to replace that spring. Remember these? They came out of the one-way clutch, the ones that I told you not to lose. So on the, see those two springs together? The one on the left is a brand new spring. The one on the right is one I took out. And notice there's a height difference. These I would always replace if they're like that, simply because I've seen it too many times where the springs compress so much that they're wore out and they crack in half. And that makes the mechanism not work anymore. So you won't have a one-way clutch anymore. It'll be a two-way clutch, which isn't a clutch. So just replace them. They're cheap. The pins as well. Just look at them and look at the top of them where they extend out and move into the one-way clutch carrier, and you'll notice some wear on them. A little bit of wear is okay, but if it starts to look really bad, just replace them. Again, they're really cheap parts, so it shouldn't be an issue. Now when you reinstall the springs and pins, be very careful not to lose them, but also put a little bit of Isoflex grease on the pins. Not too much, just a little bit, light film. So while you're cleaning, you're going to notice a lot of streaks of black on the sheaves. That's really the only important part that needs to be completely clean of anything. These black streaks form because the belt is rubbing up against the sheave at different speeds, and it's just imperative that you clean this all the way. Now notice the black stuff on the non-sheave portion. That stuff, good luck taking it off. I've never been able to take it off all the way. Just leave it there. It's not a big deal. Just clean off all the belt debris that's in it, and whatever you can do. But as for the sheave surface, that's where you're going to want to take a brass brush or a Scotch-Brite pad with brake cleaner and clean every last bit of black off of the sheave surface. Get it nice and shiny so you can eat off of it. Also, look at the sheave surface. After you clean it, feel it with your finger from inner portion to outer portion and see if you feel any abnormalities from wear. And over time you're going to notice that certain portions of that sheave are going to wear faster than other portions. And when it gets too severe, you're going to want to replace the entire sheave. Okay, so it's time to clean and relubricate the one-way clutch. So as you can see, there's a little snap ring right there. Remove that. It's on the inner portion of the one-way clutch. Remove that, clean it, and it's time to pop out the the clutch bearings. There's two of them. They're identical. Just get a punch, a small punch, and a hammer, and punch them out. They're pretty easy to come out. It's not too difficult, so you won't have to tap too many times. Clean the carrier up after you remove the bearings. Clean all the old grease off everything. Make it nice and shiny. And then you can put some Isoflex grease there in the center of the carrier. Not on where the bearings rest, but only on the center where the pins and springs hit. Take off the dust covers for the one-way clutch bearings. You can discard two of them because you're only going to need two for reassembly if this is a 450. Now if it's a 570 or whatever, then it may be different. But for the 450, you only need one dust cover per bearing. And that's per Can-Am. They actually changed it to where only one is supposed to be on, I guess for reduced drag purposes. So, needless to say, when you install the bearings, you're going to want to have the dust cover facing outward on both sides, and the insides will be open. So, take the two that you damaged the most and throw them away. Keep the two that are still kind of okay. Hopefully you didn't damage those as well. And spray those bearings out with brake cleaner. Really good. Get all that stuff out of there. Get it nice and clean. And then repack them by hand with, of course, Isoflex grease. This is probably the most important place you need to put Isoflex grease is on these bearings. If you've properly packed the bearings by now, they should look like this. Okay, I'm assuming you put the one-way clutch back together now. So don't forget that little snap ring that goes in it. Anyways, these tools, the one on the left is a 3/8 quarter inch. Sorry, it's a 3/8 socket and quarter inch. Deep socket, of course. And make sure it's one that you really don't care about because you're gonna kind of mess it up. Then the one next to it, just get any Torx bit or Allen bit that you can find that'll slide into the axle hole on the governor cup pins, or they're called axles. The next one is just a random bolt, a bolt that'll go through the hole as well, the hole of the governor cup, to push the axles out. So there's our governor cup. It's ready to be disassembled. Since we had flat spots on the rollers, we're going to have to take the plastic shoes off the sides first, and then we can press the axles out so we can get the rollers out. It might be worthy to point out that when you do this, even if 3 out of 4 rollers are okay, you're still replacing all 4 rollers regardless, so they're all even when you put everything back together. You're replacing all the rollers and all the shoes. So for the 450, there's going to be 8 shoes and 4 rollers. When you take the shoes out, you don't do it by hand like it shows here. I'm just showing you how they come out. I use a pair of pliers that have really good teeth on them. You can use, well, the manual says to use a small screwdriver, but I found more success with gripping them with a decent pair of pliers. And don't worry about damaging them because you're going to replace them anyways. Just don't damage the aluminum. Okay, for this part, this is assuming you have all the shoes out. So you're going to want to slide that Allen or Torx bit or whatever the hell you found that goes through the axle. You're going to want to put that on the end where the arrow is pointing. As you can see, the arrow is pointing to the left, but I'm putting the Torx bit on the left, because when you remove them, they only go one direction. They're supposed to only go one direction. So you will, when you're removing the little metal axles, you're going to want to push the opposite way that the arrow is pointing. Think of it this way: if everything is taken apart on that governor cup, and you need to know which way to slide the pins in, that's why they have the arrows, to show how the pins slide in. So push the pins out opposite the arrow and push them back in the direction of the arrow. So I pushed them out maybe a centimeter with that Torx bit, just enough so I could slide that bolt in and finish the job with the bolt. If you have a tool that's better than that pushes it all the way through, then go with that. But never let the vise or whatever you use to press them out with bite the aluminum surface. You don't want that. So that's why I have that 3/8 socket, so that way it protects the aluminum from the damage that a vise can do. Here's a pretty good shot of me removing one of the axles. Notice that the 3/8 socket is there to protect the governor cup. Once you get them all out, throw away all the old parts, but leave the axles. The axles are still good. Now, if the axles have rough surfaces on them, then take a wheel to it, a wire wheel, and smooth it out. Or replace them. But you can just smooth them out. It's okay. But if you remove them the proper way, they shouldn't be messed up. But if you remove them the wrong way, they might be a little scratched up. So anyways, put the new ones in, reverse of what we just did earlier. And when you tap the shoes back into place, before you do that, make sure that the axles are perfectly centered and not protruding in one direction or the other. Otherwise, the shoes won't fit properly, and then it won't slide back on the other piece properly in the end. So just use a hammer. Don't be afraid to smack it. Just do it lightly and get it on there as best it can get on. And you'll know when it's on all the way. You don't have to tap it too much. After you're done, take a punch and make a little indentation or scratch it with a knife blade or something. Do something to mar that surface, so that way you can keep track of how many times you have replaced the rollers on this governor cup. If you do it more than twice, Can-Am says to replace the governor cup completely. So that's why that's there. It's to keep track of how many times you've done it. Now I have cheated and gone beyond the 2 replacement time limit, and I've never noticed any issues. But I do notice that the axles, the more you do it, the axles are easier to slide back into place when you replace the rollers. And I guess they do that because over time the axles may slide out inadvertently with a worn out governor cup. I guess I could see that happening, but it's never happened to me yet. And I have bikes that are 15,000 miles, and I've replaced the axles plenty of times. So I don't know under what circumstances that would happen, but I guess it's fair to say it's possible. So what I would do is I would just follow the manual. So when you're reassembling, this is on the secondary clutch portion. Notice I've already put that casket-shaped piece of metal back on. I put that star piece back on first. Notice on the star piece it says engine side on one of the sides, so make sure that's facing the engine. I put a little bit of grease on that shaft there, on the inside of that shaft that I'm pointing at, so that way that the shaft is easy to remove when you do it the next time. Alright, so by now I'm assuming you've put everything together, and you just need to tighten the bolts up. Now, for the secondary clutch, sometimes you may not get it the first time quite right. So when you slide the secondary clutch on, you're going to want to make sure that the outer bearing surface is flush with that shaft, and hold it in place, put the bolt on until it's finger tight, and then try and expand the secondary clutch with the belt tool. And if it does not expand, don't try and force it. If it does not expand, then that means you're going to have to take that bolt off and try it again, because it's not properly seated. And that it has to do with that brown cam that is underneath it. And it's just a matter of getting it lined up properly. So just keep trying it. It may take 1 or 2 times to get it right. And once you get it to where the shaft is flush, and you can use that belt tool to expand the sheaves to put the belt on, then you're good to go. So just get the secondary and primary bolts finger tight, and then you're going to want to get the secondary clutch holding tool and position it the way it's shown there. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to tighten the bolt there 15 foot-pounds plus or minus 5 foot-pounds, and then you're going to want to take a breaker bar and turn it an additional 180 degrees. very important. Otherwise, your CVT system can self-destruct if you do not tighten it properly. Alright, now here is the primary clutch. Position the tool as shown. Make sure, in this picture I just wanted to emphasize that when you position the special tool, make sure it's not touching the sliding surface for the governor cup. You're going to want it exactly the way it's shown there, so that way it doesn't damage the aluminum. Alright, so here's the primary clutch again. Different view, shows how the tool is positioned against the secondary clutch to hold it in place. You're going to want to take a torque wrench to this and simply tighten it to 74 foot-pounds, plus or minus a few, but get it as close to 74 as possible. And you don't need to do any extra tightening after that. Alright, so stick the belt tool into the... Only one of those holes is threaded, by the way. Don't try and stick it in one of the holes that is not threaded. Anyways, thread it in and expand the secondary clutch and install the belt. As for belts, just go with what Can-Am builds. You can use aftermarket ones, but I find the Can-Am ones are more than adequate. The other ones will advertise longer life, but that's a bunch of BS. It's not true. I've seen them grenade just as soon as the regular Can-Am belts have. So just get the regular one. I find them actually better than the aftermarkets anyways. Note where I'm pointing the direction the belt is supposed to go. I've heard people say it doesn't matter which way they go, whatever. Who cares? Look, the rotation of the engine, it goes the way I'm pointing. Or not the way I'm pointing, but the way the belt is pointing in that picture. It's clockwise. And that also serves the purpose of if you ever take the belt off to do something in the CVT again, at least you remembered which way you put it on the first time, which is clockwise. You don't want to put the belt on one way and then 1,000 miles later you take the belt off to do something to it and then put the belt back on the other way, because that'll cause premature failure as well. So just keep it pointing that way. Let's not have any arguments about it. Just do it that way and we'll call it a day. Here it's showing me turning the secondary clutch. I'm assuming that you have the transmission in neutral, which you should. Turning it clockwise, and what that's going to do is it's going to tighten up the secondary clutch. And as you've noticed, I've already turned it quite a ways, and the belt is tightening up onto the clutch is tightening up on the belt. And I'm just showing here that the belt is on, and it's on a certain direction, and that the secondary clutch has been tightened up to its limit. You don't want to leave the belt loose without tightening up the secondary clutch, because when you turn it on, the belt is going to slip initially, and it'll cause initial damage. It won't blow the belt or anything, but it'll sure as hell do something to it. So just tighten it up so that way that doesn't happen. One important thing about this whole operation is do not put any grease anywhere on this system that I have not told you. If you do, you'll probably have issues down the road. Only put grease where I told you. Remember that. Make sure you put the cover on, and do not mess up the threads on the cover bolts, because they're very fragile. So just hardly tighten them, barely tighten them, and you'll be okay. And make sure you tighten the two hose clamps for the inlet and outlet. Put all the plastics back on, and you should be good to go. As you can see here, I really enjoy working on these bikes. Kind of, not really. I don't know, sorta. They're great bikes. I love them. I've heard nothing but good things about their performance, other than the few quirks, such as the belt. There must be a dozen other things that are common problems with these that I found after 15,000 miles of use. Anyways, great bikes. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please leave the comments. I don't care if they're good or bad. It doesn't hurt my feelings none. But I'll answer any questions you guys have. I'll try to, at least. I'm not the expert, but almost. Not quite, though. Anyways, thanks for watching, and see you next time.